You asked, we answered. Today we have a great Q&A session with SCHEELS Pro Jason Mitchell, mainly on walleye talk. We're doing questions on areas, baits, rods, reels, electronics, even get a little history lesson at the end. All right, Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. We've got, I got a pretty good list of questions in front of me right now. I put out a Instagram story about asking for questions since we're having a podcast with Jason Mitchell. So got a few really good ones for you. Are you ready for it?
I guess so.
All right, here we go. So first one is a little bit specific to your home waters. Where do you target walleye in the spring with lower than normal runoff?
Well, if you're talking like pre-spawn, I mean, there's not a lot of water coming into the lake. Obviously, there's always some current, where you look at the, how the ice goes out early in the spring. But Channel A, I mean, there's hardly any water movement through there right now, not compared to some of the past years. And I guess what I find is when we have a lot of snow, we have a lot of runoff coming in, the fish just run a lot further. They'll run up past Dry Lake, for example, up, in some of those ditches to the north and west of Dry Lake. They'll run north of Irving way up to almost all the way over towards Candu, and so the fish run up a lot further when that water's moving. When that water isn't moving, I feel like it's more confined to some of the older bridges. And the other thing that I've had some success with is, even looking at some of that stuff, between Devil's Lake and Stump Lake, it seems like there's a lot more wind-driven current through there, and it doesn't rely so much on spring runoff. And so there's a couple of options, but yeah, I mean, even like the Mabe Coulee Bridge, a 6 Mile Bay Bridge, you don't have to, do quite as much exploring it down some of the back roads, but at the same time too, it does get busier and it gets more crowded, and the fish don't stick around as long either, so I mean, we've seen this in the past, but yeah, I mean, if you're in a boat, as soon as that spawn's over, get back in protected bays that are maybe, you want at least 6 feet usually, but try to use your temperature gauge. Your temperature gauge will find more walleyes in the spring than anything right after the spawn on Devil's Lake.
Mm-hmm. So you're going to notice a lot of fish pushing a little bit earlier then with the lower amount of current?
Well, I mean, you'll see stages where the males show up first, and then the females are a step behind. Then the females leave first, and then the males leave later. The males are around some of those locations along us. And basically what you're just looking for is any type of a bottleneck or something that creates some current. And then with riprap or some type of rock, you don't always need current. I mean, there's walleyes that spawn, in that Cactus Point area, for example. Mission Bay is a big spawning area on Devil's Lake. I've seen walleyes spawning, in some of the deep gravel bars out front of the Strummy Edition. So I mean, I think by design, Mother Nature spreads the risk, and fish are doing different things at different depths at different times. The range that walleyes will spawn in is kind of a wider range. I mean, 43 to 50 inches. And I think that's by design too, where the fish, the spawn is staggered, so in that way there's more likelihood that, some of them survive. There's even been documentation of walleyes spawning under the ice when you have a really, really late winter. Like up in Canada, that has been documented a lot more, where the winters are so long that, that light period gets a certain time and things are warming up. And, up there too, there's a lot of flowages where you've got warmer water under the ice because you've got water coming in from so many different places. They have such a snowpack in some of those places that, that water is running in through the streams and it's running in from the shoreline and it's warmer. And even though the lake is still frozen because there was 3 feet of ice or more on it, the water is probably warmer than freezing, and so, up there, the lakes thaw out from the bottom up a lot, and so, I don't know, I mean, but you'll see it staggered, and then sometimes then you throw in the dirt, the dirty water is the curse of the spring. If you get, like some rain or some snow, early spring, late winter, and it melts fast and it really clouds up and dirties the water, it's going to be tougher fishing, but if you can see even 6 inches to a foot, usually it's pretty good.
Nice. Okay, next one's a little bit more general. So favorite spring presentation for walleye and for panfish? Maybe give us a couple of them.
It really varies on where you're at. With fishing, I always joke, you never say always and you never say never. Where you're fishing, it can vary so dramatically just by how if you're a reservoir, if you're a lake, and how, what the structure is available, what the bait fish are, what the forage base looks like. On Devil's Lake, if you're asking Devil's Lake specifically, I think it's really, really tough to beat just a jig and a paddle tail, just a soft plastic for binding fish and for covering some water. Once you find the fish, it's pretty tough to beat a slip bobber and a leech. As for panfish, I'm a big fan of just using a bobber and a hair jig, or a bobber and a jig and plastic. If it's a tough, weird bite, you can use a jig and a minnow below a float. And there's all kinds of good options. I mean, Northland's got that. It's called the Crappie King. It's a little hair jig. And I'm not kidding you. I mean, you think plastics are durable, and I've caught 30, 40, 50 fish easy on one hair jig, and they just keep on catching. Then there's all kinds of great soft plastics for panfish as well. And so I like the durability of soft plastics. But, you go to some other areas and it's more like for walleyes, for example, like around the opener, it might be more of a jig and a minnow bite where you'll catch a few on plastics, but you'll catch a lot more with a jig and a shiner, for example. There's other areas where, every lake is a little different. But I would say across the board early in the year, it's tough to beat pitching jigs, because a lot of the fish are shallow and you have a hard time driving the boat over the top of them, the fish spook. And I feel like when you're pitching too, you're covering so much more area where you're casting in. And so if you're casting into 3 feet of water, for example, you're covering that depth and you're going all the way back to the boat. And if the boat's in, say, 12 feet of water, you're covering that too, whereas if you're dragging something below or behind the boat, you're pretty much in one depth.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And yeah, it's tough to beat a jig and a paddle tail, just feeling that thump. That's
fun,
so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned when you were talking there is using hair jigs under slip bobbers. So that's something I've never really done before. Do you have to work the bait much, or can you just let it sit and let that hair float? Does that give you enough movement?
Well, I'm usually twitching it and working it. I mean, if you twitch it, give a little bit of a couple of twitches and let it stop, right when it stops, a lot of times when they hit. And two, I feel like if you're fishing, like a lot of times we're catching crappies, less than 6-7 feet of water. A lot of times they're only 4 or 5 feet down, 3 feet down, especially if there's some sun. And I find that just an old school clip-on bobber works even better than a slip bobber because your line doesn't slide up the bobber, and I just feel like your jig just stays in the zone better. It's kind of a pendulum effect where that jig is swinging below the bobber. And hair jigs work great. You can use a minnow that way too, a jig and a plastic. But a lot of times, we're just casting out, especially with, if you're using forward-facing sonar, if the fish are up high, you'll see them swimming around, and you just cast towards them. And sometimes, like where you're at, like in that Detroit Lakes, Otter Tail area, the water is so clear over there that you can physically see the fish, And it's a deal where you're just trying to keep the boat back away from the fish and cast up into them or cast past them and work through them so you don't spook them because they are spooky. And, it's just some little twitches, some little hops and stop, twitch, twitch, stop, twitch, twitch, stop. And you can vary from that basic cadence, but yeah, you're working it a little bit, and you're working it for a couple of reasons: to trigger the fish, make it look alive, but then also too to cover water and pull it away from the fish and come into contact with more fish as well. But it's deadly.
Great answer. Okay, we're getting a little bit more gear oriented with this one. So the question is go-to rod reel setup for spring and early summer walleye. And I think we'll have to break this down by fishing types. So say you're using a jig and a paddle tail. What's your favorite rod reel setup?
Oh, so here's what I'll tell you. And I always look at, I always tell people, I guess, what I want somebody to tell me, if you're using a presentation where you're not holding onto the rod, you don't need as much rod. Okay. Because, it's not like the sensitivity is going to be that big of a deal. And so, for example, if you're just starting out, the other thing is we always want to try to make fishing less intimidating. If you're just starting out, if you're going to spend money on a rod, I would say your best rod should be your jigging rod. And what I mean by best rod is like, the most expensive components. Okay. And so like, it just varies on what you want. I mean, I've got some of those. I was never a big spender on fishing rods, to be honest with you, because I come from the guiding world where by the end of the summer, all your rods are broke. Okay. And so all I did is, I mean, I had good equipment, but for me, I just had to have rods that were good enough. Right. And because, people just would break them. And so I never bought really expensive rods, through my career. Well, then at about 4 or 5 years ago, I finally splurged and I bought one of those SCHEELS 1 rods. And I tell you what, especially with like 6-pound mono and a jig, I mean, it is a beautiful rod to fish with. It's like, wow, it's the nicest fishing rod I've ever had. If you're looking for, but do you need that good of a rod? Yeah. If you want, I mean, they're nice, but you can get by with less if you have to or want to. And so I've been using a lot of those walleye series. To me, they're just a good economical rod. Get them for, I don't remember what the retail is. I want to say the retail is right around $150, but it's a great rod.
They're at 140.
Okay, so I mean, it's a phenomenal rod for $140. I use those all the time. And then there's a Ibisu that's black that is a great rod too for the money. And I want to say that's about $130 to $140 rod. To me, those are great jigging rods, phenomenal jigging rods for plastics, for whenever you're holding on to the rod and you want some feel. And it's a fatigue thing too, where you're just using a higher quality graphite with less resin. So they're less weight, physical weight. Like pitch and cranks, pitch and jigs, drop shots, anything where I want that sensitivity, I want that feel. That's where I'll use what I would consider a higher end rod, especially like jigs and mono. With braided line, I feel like you can get by with less of a rod because the braid adds so much sensitivity. But there's times where monofilament, especially early in the year, in the springtime especially, there's times where monofilament will just flat out fish braid by a big margin. And so that's what I would tell you is, jigs and mono, that's where you want your best setups as far as spending money. And then everything else, you can pick your battles and get by with less. For example, a trolling rod, you just need the right length, the right action, the right, it's more of a moderate parabolic action. Bottom bouncers, if you're running a bottom bouncer in the rod holder, you just need a rod that bends over right, and so it's not as technical.
So when we're on rod talk, this is getting a little bit later into the season, but what is your rod recommendation for doing glide baits? And does it change based on like the season or the size of the glide bait you use?
No, so my favorite is like I don't want an overly long rod because it just wears you down. Okay. And I don't want a rod that's got any type of softness in the tip because it wears you down. And so I like, if I were to pick a perfect glide bait rod, it'd be like a 6'2", 6'4". And I think too, it depends on your height and your wingspan as far as how long your arms are. But 6'2", 6'4", with a medium fast that fishes heavy, or extra fast. I do not want a soft tip at all. I like that stiff tip where I can just pop, 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 and get that glide bait working with using just my wrist without having to use any other parts of my arms or my shoulders or anything like that. And the whole thing is a lot of times you have to pop it pretty hard to just get that glide bait to swing up off the bottom where those fish can see it and chase it down. And then also too, when it hits the bottom, a lot of times that's where fish will hit it. Walleyes will pin it right on the bottom. And so sometimes I'll almost even kind of feather it right on the bottom where I can feel them pick it up, and set the hook. But a lot of times those fish are just on that bait when you pop it again. And so every pop is basically a hook set. And so I like to use like a medium extra fast, or even be close to a medium heavy extra fast, or really stiff rod. And that's one situation too where I will spend a little bit more money on a glide bait rod, just from a fatigue standpoint. I don't want a heavy club. You just can't. It's not comfortable to do all day. I've been using those Ibisus quite a bit. There's a couple of different Ibisus. There's a black one. I've been using that a lot for glide baits. It's got a very fast tip. I like that rod for plastics and swim baits and stuff too. But and I always use braided line. I mean, there's people that go back and forth. Some people I know, they catch a lot of fish in glide baits using mono. Their mentality is that, those tiny hooks on glide baits, if you put too much on a fish, they're going to tear out, and you catch a lot of fish in the face and stuff with glide baits. And I like to use braid like a thin diameter braid like that Suffix. I think it's called Suffix 832. I used to use Nanafill before they discontinued that. But and one thing I always do is have a little tiny swivel about 3 feet, 4 feet above the glide bait, depending on how clear the water is. I'll go as short as I can. If I can use 2 feet, I will. And that swivel is really important for taking that, just softening up some of that twist, because when you pop that bait, you got to chase it down on slack line. And when you chase it down on slack line, if that line wraps on your rod tip around a guide, it's going to cost you a lot of fish. And so, always use a tiny barrel swivel, then usually just a fluorocarbon leader. I like to tie direct to the glide bait. I feel like I get less tangled up and I feel like it hooks up better. But again, I know some people that catch a lot of fish on glide baits use a crankbait snap, to connect the bait. So just some of it's personal preference. You do have to set your drag a little lighter and baby the fish if you're using braid compared to mono. Mono, I feel like it's just more foolproof once you get a fish pinned up. If you get a fish pinned up on just that tiny little tail hook, for example, or the back hook on like a jigging ramp, monofilament's a lot more forgiving. But one thing I've started doing too is using a lot of baits with oversized hooks. Like that pitching puppet's a phenomenal glide bait. And if I was, if I had to go back to guiding, I mean, if I was using glide baits, that would be something that I would do or recommend, because compared to some other glide baits that have a lot smaller bill, it just takes so much less to get the bait to work. That was probably the biggest thing is, every one of these baits seems to have different cadences and different strokes that make the bait shine. And one of the things I found with that particular bait was, using jigging wraps, for example. I've got, a handful of different things I really like to do with the rod to make that bait pop and catch fish. And it seemed like with the pitching puppet, sometimes that would be too much for that particular bait. It was a lot softer, easier cadence. And it's a softer, easier cadence. It's easier to teach. And it's easier for people to do if they haven't used glide baits a lot, as far as from a fatigue standpoint, where you can just get by with a softer jig stroke. You don't have to pop it as hard. You don't have to lift the bait so high. And I think it's because that oversized fin on the back makes that bait glide a lot further. And then that oversized hook on the back is a lot more forgiving when you get them on that. I mean, that's like catching a fish on a spinner bait. It's got a big wide gap hook on the back end that keeps fish pinned up. And so I've fallen in love with that bait over the last couple of summers.
Yeah, that's something I definitely need to try, is that pitch and puppet. And I was definitely intrigued with your comment about larger hooks too, because I know I've struggled a lot with like hookup ratio when I'm using glide baits. So like using a larger hook, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, and here's how you wrap your head around glide baits. I mean, at first there was like a lot of mystique with it, at least for me. I mean, personally, and here's what I mean by that is, you'd be on a spot and you'd be catching just enough fish where you knew the fish were there and you were marking them. But it was just catching, was like pulling your hair out. I'm talking, jigging a minnow or whatever. You're doing all these traditional methods in, just, frustration. And I can't tell you how many times where, you put on a glide bait, like back then it was a jigging wrap, and you throw that bait out there and 1-2 pops and you're hooked up almost immediately. It was like turning on a light switch. And, before forward facing sonar, I mean, there was just a lot of mystique because we didn't understand. I don't think, at least for myself, we didn't understand or realize exactly what was happening. And here's, I think, what happens a lot, especially as you get later on in the summer, where the fish suspend way more than what we ever envision. And part of it is because a lot of times when you go over the top of fish with a boat, they push into the bottom. They're notorious for that. And so you'll drive off the end of a point, for example, in 23 feet of water, and you'll see 4 fish right on the end of the point, and they're 1-2 feet off the bottom. Well, you see those fish, and then you try to fish them, okay? Not realizing that those higher fish, they were 5, 6, 7 feet off the bottom, before you drove over the top of it and they reacted to your presence. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And before forward facing sonar, I don't know if we really quite understood that very well. I think if there was anybody that understood it, was some of the guys out on the Great Lakes. That a trick that they would do out there was they would run over the fish wide open, and wherever they seen the clutter and the marks at those high speeds is where they would set up their planter boards, because if you drove slow over the fish, again, they would sink and drop down and they would push away from the boat. And so to get that baseline as far as, okay, do I need to be 6 feet down, 10 feet down? How far do I need to run my baits? They would run over them wide open to establish that, because you can't establish that when you troll at your trolling speeds, because the fish are reacting to your presence. Okay. And so those fish are a lot higher off the bottom a lot of times than what we envisioned or imagined. And all that's happening with a glide bait is that when you pop it, that bait comes up it doesn't hardly take. You pop your rod 3 or 4 feet, just boom, a 6 foot rod, and that bait will fly up 6, 7 feet off the bottom, sometimes more if you want it to. And what happens is those fish that are 5, 6, 7 feet up off the bottom, that bait comes in front of them momentarily, then glides down and glides away. Those fish see it and they chase it down and pin it to the bottom. Okay. Whereas before we were fishing below the fish all day and didn't even realize it, And so that's what's happening with these glide baits. And so once you see them with forward facing sonar, you see it becomes so obvious. It's like, whoa, that's what's happening. Well, then guess what? You start throwing a jig in a crawler or a jig in a plastic, and you start getting it up off the bottom where the fish can see it, letting them chase it down. It's catching fish too. But I think the glide baits kind of taught that to us by accident, eventually before forward-facing sonar, because before forward-facing sonar, it was just so mystical to me how you could fish through an area, nothing, then throw a jigging Rap down out there and bam, it's just instant. Like, why? How? Is it a reaction? These fish, I think most of us just thought these fish were just laying on the bottom, and that jigging Rap kind of created some kind of a reaction, and then how the fish hit too, where you just pop that hook and those fish are just there. It was hard for us to wrap our head around, I think, at first, but forward facing sonar showed us a lot of what, I guess the biggest thing I think with forward facing sonar is it's taught us so many things that are new that where we were wrong before. We didn't know as much as we thought we did.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's definitely a valuable tool just from a knowledge perspective.
Oh, just understanding. Absolutely. Just how many fish are, you look at it now and it's like, wow, how did we ever catch big fish before? And how we ever catch fish on structure? Because if there's fish on structure, there's usually a lot more of them just wandering the abyss randomly, and that's where those fish on structure come from, Mm-hmm. And what's crazy is that they only spend a little part of their time on that. The rest of the time they're just out floating around, so yeah, we've learned a lot, no doubt.
Absolutely. So couple lure specific questions. How do you work a chatterbait for walleye, and what structure do you target? And how early are you willing to tie one on in the season?
Well, I like chatterbaits a lot. I feel like they're probably one of the most underrated walleye lures. I would say that in drop shotting. I like to use them like in the Dakotas especially. We've got some great situations where chatterbaits work really well. I'm talking like eastern South Dakota, that Wabash, Webster area, these glacial lakes, and obviously your Devil's Lake, any of these sloughs, where we're fishing a lot of shorelines and we're fishing shallow and we're fishing weeds. And I think there's a little bit of noise, a little bit of vibration, and you can fish them slow. You can fish them fairly fast. Sometimes I'll fish them kind of high and fast to get over the tops of weeds, especially later on. To go slow. It seems like to me, chatterbaits are kind of like a spinner bait. And what I mean, whereas like with jigs and cranks, I give it a lot more pop and a lot more start and stop to the lure, to the retrieve. Whereas with spinners, chatterbaits, spinner baits, it just seems like I just keep those blades going all the way back to the boat. And I might give it a little bit of a hiccup, a little bit of a twitch, maybe a little bit of a surge in speed, and then a slow down, but it's it's more of like a yo-yo where you might speed up and slow down, speed up and slow down, where it's not as much twitchiness, if that makes any sense, like what we do with the crankbait. And so, yeah, I mean, they work really well, really well.
What are your recommendations on trailers for them?
I almost always use a soft plastic paddle tail trailer, like a pro swimmer's phenomenal trailer on a chatterbait. That's one of my best ones, actually.
So why like a paddle tail versus something that's just got like a slender profile at the end?
You could, I mean, again, there's all kinds of different things you can do. Some of it is, you do something and it works and you get confidence and it's like, well, why would I try that when I know this works? I think that happens to us, which can be really good and it can be really bad. Sometimes it can keep us from learning things. I've always been a bigger fan of the paddle tail. Whenever there's stain in the water, maybe it's turbidity from wind, maybe it's algae blooms, but a lot of times we get some stain in the water in dirtier water. And I feel like that extra thump helps. I always felt like the flukes in my mind shined more so popping them and twitching them in clearer water, if that makes any sense. I mean, I've caught fish on fluke type tails in all kinds of different water, but that's just where my preference lies. And then again, the chatterbait, I don't know if it's a bait that I would have a lot of confidence throwing in really clear water. It seems like they shine when there's algae blooms and there's some color in the water, and they really shine around weeds. Like if you've got a lot of that, like in Devil's Lake and some other areas, we got a lot of this, what's called sago pondweed. It's a really thin, narrow strand. It's a tall, it'll grow up to like 6-7 feet in a lot of our lakes. And the walleyes love that sago pondweed. And if you don't know what it is, just look it up on your phone. Identify sago pondweed so you know what it looks like. But it's kind of a stringy, grassy weed, and it can be tricky to drag anything through. And the chatterbaits just kind of slide right through it, And so those are the situations where I really like the chatterbait. In weeds and stain water, I don't know. I'm a big fan of that thump on that paddle tail because you got to pull fish to you.
Makes sense. So you kind of set up this next lure I'm going to ask about because you mentioned it, but drop shots. When are you going to start using a drop shot?
Well, I've been using drop shots a lot, and I'm surprised that more walleye anglers aren't talking about them because they work so well. Obviously, if you're doing any smallmouth bass fishing or if you're a bass angler in general, you're very familiar with a drop shot. And to me, the drop shot might be one of the most underrated walleye presentations that's out there. Here's what I find. There's a lot of lakes with good fishing, but there's maybe lower population densities of fish, or maybe there's high forage bases where the fish are just notoriously a little tough to catch. Okay. There's a lot of lakes in northern Minnesota like that, in Wisconsin, where they're good fishing lakes. There's nothing wrong with them, but just the way the bite is and the way the forage base is, a lot of times it ends up being a lake that you can catch fish more easily with live bait. And if you get away from live bait, it's a little harder. Okay. Especially when you get away from the weeds, you start fishing structure. Okay. And there's a lot of lakes like that, or the windows where you can catch fish without live bait are just a little bit more narrow than, dragging a creek chub or a red tail around on a rig, or a slip bobber on a leech, or with a leech, or a jig and a shiner. I mean, I can just think of quite a few lakes where, if I'm being honest, if I really had to catch a lot of fish and there was a gun to my head, I'd have live bait in the boat, right? I feel like the drop shot is kind of the counterpunch, where there's a lot of lakes that are like that, and you go in there with a drop shot and you catch those fish that you would swore would have only hit a live bait rig and a leech, or a slip bobber and a leech, or a jig and a minnow. I mean, it's deadly. Now, is it a great way to cover a lot of water? No. I mean, it's great with forward-facing sonar. It's great with your spot lock and position on a specific piece of structure. Typically we're just making short casts at locations or at fish, and it's just there are a lot of different ways you can fish a drop shot. One thing, and I don't know if it's just coincidence or what, but I tried drop shots off and on for a few years, and I caught walleyes with them, but it was nothing great that really impressed me. And for whatever reason, when I started using a longer tag between the hook and the weight, for whatever reason, I started catching a lot more walleyes. Like it more than quadrupled the number of walleyes I was catching on a drop shot, where I went from, say, like a, I don't know, 12 to 15 inch dropper to a 2-foot dropper. Okay. And I don't know if it's just longer hang time where that bait can float down. Maybe the fish are positioned a little higher up off the bottom than what we give them credit for in a lot of cases. And there's just something with the action when you've got a little bit more weight, distance between the hook and the weight. But for whatever reason, when I made that adjustment, for walleyes anyways, drop shotting completely changed for me, and across the board, over several days. My favorite is like those eye candy rigging leeches. Those are so unbelievable. I mean, if I never say, oh, I only need one bait, but if I could only have one bait, that would be it. I mean, you put that on a drop shot, it is unbelievable. I mean, it's hard for fish to resist it. It's like live bait. I mean, it's hard for fish to resist a leech. Like when you can't catch, I always joke, when you can't catch walleyes on a plain hook and a leech, you're in deep trouble. That's how this is. I mean, there's not many of them that don't eat it.
Yep. How early in the fishing season are you willing to use drop shots?
From here on out.
Oh, really? So like springs, as soon as it opens?
Here's what's so crazy on it. A lot of times I'll use like a 3/8 ounce weight, right? Which in 5 feet of water is big time overkill, right? But on a drop shot, you can throw that heavy weight up into 6 feet of water. You can throw it out to 32 feet of water, right? I mean, the water that you can fish, because, again, you can have that heavy weight, but the fish hits that leech and you feel that thump. The size of the weight doesn't matter as far as impeding your bite detection or the ability of the fish to move enough water to suck the bait in. So, yeah, I mean, you can use them a lot of different ways. Now, I don't use them so much in thick weeds. I mean, you can use them on weed edges and stuff like that, but any type of open, clean, clear structure where I can see fish, especially, it's pretty deadly, especially, and that's just too, assuming that, the fish are somewhat near the bottom. Fish that are on the bottom, again, if fish are halfway down the water column or something like that, I probably, wouldn't, it's not something I would mess with, but when fish are on the bottom, it's deadly.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing I would add too, maybe, is that, a firmer bottom, sand, gravel, rock. I don't know if, that weight hitting the bottom with soft mud, like say like your mud flats on Mille Lacs, I don't know if that would be an answer so much, because you stir so much stuff up that, the fish might not be able to see your bait, but sand, gravel, rock, it's deadly.
Nice. Makes a lot of sense. How about Ned rigs? Do you spend much time fishing with them?
Oh yeah. Remember when my kids were little, it's like, I just hopefully we can just catch a bass here right away. I'd always have a Ned rig on their rods. Or if you have somebody in the boat that you're worried that, they're going to want to go in an hour and they're not going to have fun or whatever, put a Ned rig on their rod. It's I mean, especially in this part of the world, when you get lakes where there's smallmouths and walleyes, they catch everything.
Mm-hmm. What about like cadence on a Ned rig? Do you just let it sit, or are you popping it fairly frequently?
All the above. I mean, here's the thing is, you learn so much sometimes just fishing with people, where like I felt like guiding was such a blessing for me, because I'd have 2 or 3 people in my boat every day, and invariably they'd be doing things that I wouldn't have done, right? And sometimes you get some lessons force-fed to you that way, in a good way. In that, I got my ideas of how I think I should run a Ned rig, for example, where I'll kind of creep along the bottom and give a few twitches, and, I kind of got this idea of what I want it to look like. And you've got some guy in the back of the boat, and he's holding a spinning rod upside down, and he's just throwing it out there and letting it sit. And then as the boat moves, it drags along the bottom a little bit, and goodness, he's caught 4 now, and I haven't caught one. And so, sometimes, you get your things that you're confident in with fishing, and you have your things that, should work, but sometimes you have to, kind of get your eyes open a little bit too, and realize that, there's other things that work too. And if something that you're using, if you've given it a good effort, that's not working, you need to try something else. The trouble is that a lot of times is people were not confident with those other things. And so we just keep going with what we caught fish with before. And so sometimes that's why some of those lessons are easier to learn with other people, where if you have people in the boat with you, even if it's just friends or spouse, whatever, and they're catching fish and you're not, pay attention and match what they're doing. But here's what's really fascinating. And I don't know, I'm no psychologist, obviously, but I can't tell you how many times when I was guiding, where one person would just, maybe they've caught 10 fish, okay, and the other person hasn't caught any, and they would fight it and resist it and just make reasons and justify why they wouldn't change or whatever. And it's like, that's what, as fishermen, that's what you got to get over is, if something's working, match up. Like there's no pride, there's no, I don't know why some people can't make that adjustment, but it's surprising how many people can't or won't and don't. And I mean, if you want to be, stubborn and right and whatever it is in your head, fine. But I even go as far as like all my rods and reels are the exact same. Okay, where like for certain presentations, right? Like if we're going along a shoreline pitching cranks on Devil's Lake, I want everybody in the boat using the exact same rod, the exact same reel, size reel, the exact same line. I want my spools all spooled up the same. I want everything identical on that front. So that way, if one person starts catching fish, I can immediately match everybody in the boat. Maybe they're reeling a little faster and they're getting a little deeper on the bottom of the dive curve right when the lure hits the boat. Maybe they're doing something, right? It's so much easier to match up when everybody's using the same thing. I can just watch somebody. Like if you catch 3 fish and I haven't caught a fish yet, within 10 minutes or so, I can get on track in a hurry by just, okay, my retrieve is the same as yours. Now I'm holding my rod the same angle, keep everything the same. So that way when something's working, you can get everybody in the boat catching fish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great answer there. And then, when it comes to like trying new things, I think like a lot of times people start with their confidence bait. And then if they're not catching fish, try a different tactic. And it's like something they haven't tried before. And then, maybe it's just not a good day and they're not, successful with that new tactic, and then they just give up on it right away. So it's like, try it when you're having a little bit of success, put yourself in better situations.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a hard hill to climb sometimes. And there's no easier right or wrong way. Here's the thing, as long as you're having fun with fishing, you're doing it right.
Mm-hmm.
But what I find, I think if we're all being honest, is that sometimes it's so much easier to learn and expand through other people. And what I mean by that is, like, I've got some, I don't have a big circle, like on Devil's Lake, as far as people I really talk to and like tell them exactly what I'm doing. But I have a really good circle, like a small circle of people that most of the time when we go out fishing, we like with my buddies, we might fish together once or twice a year or fish during a tournament together. The rest of the time we'll both be on the water at the same day, but we're fishing by ourselves just so we can try more stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go over there. You know what? I'm going to try this, and it's like we just have a quest for learning, and sometimes it's easier to expand as far as presentations and lures and things like that by like a collaborative effort. It's like when I was guiding every day, that was easy. Somebody, I'd say, oh, use a countdown or a plastic or whatever it was at the time. And I'd look over the back of the boat a little while later and they're using something that I've never seen before. And boy, is that thing even tuned? And they'd be like, yeah, this is what I use up in Canada all the time. I'm like, okay. And I learned a long time ago, as soon as you say, well, you're not in Canada, they'll catch 10 fish in a row and make you look like an idiot, right? So you just kind of keep your mouth shut. And sometimes you just have to wait for the day to unfold. And so it's a deal where if their friends catch a few fish and they haven't caught a fish yet, pretty soon they're asking for one of those lures as well. Then okay, and you get them set up and hopefully they start catching fish. But sometimes you would get things force fed to you, like I was talking about earlier, where wow, I would have never used that lure, and they've caught 4 fish on it, and we've only caught one other fish besides that, and so sometimes you can use that to your advantage, and so like when you have different people in the boat, for example, it's good if people are trying different things, especially when you're not catching them, um, if you're fishing a tournament, I mean, you know this, right? Where, if you're fishing a tournament, usually, you're not all doing the same thing, at least when you're not catching fish. Like if you've gone half an hour and you haven't had a bite, one person's trying crawlers, one person's trying leeches, one person's doing this, one person's doing that. Like you're mixing it up to try to figure out what it is again that the fish want. And so, and as you do that, invariably, before you have success with it, it's hard to have a lot of confidence with it, And I think too, people are just stubborn. And here's something I would point out, just an observation from my own life. I mean, I'm 50 years old now, or I'll be 50 on Monday. And so by the time this airs, I'll be at the half-century mark. And I remember growing up, and people were always saying, "Oh, you can't," the old saying, "Can't teach an old dog new tricks." As I've gotten older, I was like, "Wow, I got to work really hard to learn new tricks, like way harder than when I was 20." And so like I remember being like 20, 25 years old when GPS was like brand new, and there was no mapping or whatever, but you go out there and there's certain speeds where your position would disappear. I mean, it was really rudimentary compared to what's available today. And getting waypoints and finding spots and saving them and stuff. And I remember, at that time, people that were older than me, kind of making fun, "Oh, I don't need a GPS to find that." And none of us realized that Seven Sisters actually was Seven Sisters. It was every time we went back there, we were probably on a different spot on the, a different hump on the area. But, until you have all that mapping, you don't realize all of that. But, I remember just embracing technology. I remember going on, before Google Earth existed, there was a website called TerraServer. And I would spend days on that in the wintertime, looking at aerial black and white photos and moving latitude and longitude around to find spots on the Minnewacan Flats, for example, that were now flooded, that were, dry in the 60s, and embracing technology that way, and I felt like in a lot of cases, learning technology before everybody else did, that was a big advantage. Like that was something that put me ahead, figuring out that TerraServer back in the day, and having access to all those aerial photography, all those pictures, and then being able to find latitude, longitude, and then punching it into a GPS. I mean, I know that was something that put me way ahead of a lot of people. I found stock dams, rock piles, I mean, you name it. I mean, it was amazing. And so now, now I fast forward to today, and it's like I got to work 2-3 times harder, it feels like, to keep up, because you get comfortable doing something, and as new things come in, it's like it's not easy anymore. And so, but the way I look at it is, fishing is my job. It's a pretty good job. I
can think of a lot worse out there.
I love going to work every day, but it's like, what, if I got to work hard at this to keep up and to keep on the edge of things, and if I got to work hard, I got to work hard. It's different now because I actually got to read an owner's manual. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You could mount a piece of electronics on your boat and not have to read much at all, so it's just the deal where back in the day you'd mount your electronics, and the magic is what you figured out on the water. I think in today's world you got to spend way more time reading the owner's manual, programming keys, shortcuts. I mean, understanding your settings, playing with your settings. I mean, in today's world, if you really want to be ahead, I feel like you'd better take a day or two where all you do is focus on your electronics and you never put a line in the water. That's really, it'll pay off dividends for the rest of the time you own that boat and that piece of electronics, and so it's, the world's changing.
Oh, it is. It's incredible. And yeah, just how far technology has come. And, and we talk about embracing technology. I mean, forward-facing sonar comes to mind right away. For the people that have just jumped into that and don't really know how to use it yet, what are some of your best tips for that?
Well, so here's the thing is by putting forward, I think you have to have realistic expectations. Okay. It's not like you're going to start lowering the lake from catching so many fish. I would dare argue that for most walleye anglers, the first year they could very well catch way fewer fish with forward-facing sonar. And the reason being is that you have to relearn some hard-learned lessons. Before forward-facing sonar, there's kind of an old saying, you don't leave fish to find fish, in the sense that a lot of times if you could just slow down, not let a lull rattle your cage or you start running around all over the lake, and you just kind of get into a groove and you just kind of wait things out in a good spot, usually you would be rewarded. And it took a certain amount of experience or repetition on the water to kind of get to that conclusion, right? And now you do have to leave fish. Like you make a cast or two with those fish, and if you don't move them, on to the next one. And so you have to relearn it, and you really have to be a lot more diligent as far as managing your time. The day can get away from you so fast with forward-facing sonar, more so than anything that I've ever seen in fishing. 4 or 5 hours can spin by so fast. And the other thing is there's a lot of nuance to it. Identifying fish species is probably one of the big ones. Even with 2D sonar, I mean, I can't tell you how many times we're looking back. It's like, wow, we spent a lot of time trying to catch them suckers that would, but there's certain, in suckers are probably one of the worst ones. A white sucker, for whatever reason, on a lot of electronics, does look a lot like a walleye. And what I find is that if it feels like you're invisible and you're just beating your head against your windshield, very well could be suckers. Even in Devil's Lake, especially like in East Bay, Black Tiger Bay, East Devil's Lake, it's shocking how many suckers there are in some spots, and so there's a lot to learn. There's always nuance and everything. Nothing's as easy as what people want to think, and so there's some situations, for example, with crappies and they're suspended up off the bottom, walleyes and they're suspended up off the bottom, but then too that means standing up on the deck of your boat and casting at fish, and if you're not going to stand in the boat, stand in the waves. If you're not that good or accurate at casting, some of those things might not be for you, but you can still point it around and look for fish and then drag the boat with a trolling motor over to where you see fish, assuming that they're not spooking from the boat. And so there's a lot to learn with it. But it's like anything else, there's, and I've always been a proponent of technology. I don't feel like, people. So there's a lot of negativity with fishing right now, but there's a lot of negativity in general, and I look at like spot lock. I mean, like some people, people that are against forward-facing sonar, they're calling forward-facing sonar units cheater boxes, right? And if anybody wins a term, especially if they're a young person, they try to discredit them, right? Well, 15 years ago, we weren't calling them cheater pedals. You don't know how to control a boat. You haven't been fishing that long. No, you just roll in here and hit your button on your spot lock. Who do you think you are? You don't know nothing. I mean, come on, but, or mapping, I mean, how mapping changed everything. And so I guess that's the from a social perspective, as far as just being human beings, that's all we've done since the beginning of time is try to figure out better and newer ways to get to the end zone, The rods are better, the bolts are faster and better, the technology, electronics, even the live wells are better, But what influences the fishing or the fish itself as far as from a biological impact, it's never been the technology, it's always been us, okay? And so you look at like North America, when the first human beings crossed the Alaska land bridge, there were several big mammals in North America at the time. There was like a 3-toed horse. There was a giant sloth. I read some interesting stuff on this. And anthropologists today concur that, in a very short window of time, a lot of those big mammals went extinct, okay, from some of the first human beings. And so, how many people were in North America at that time? I don't know. You got to guess at a lot fewer than today, right? But, you think about that where as human beings, we've wiped animals off the planet with nothing but spears, okay? And so, now people are like, oh, that's like using a rangefinder, using this, using that. You look at white-tailed deer in North America. I mean, the white-tailed deer numbers exploded during the same time that compound bows, as we know them today, started to become in existence. When trail cameras came on the scene, there's never been a correlation between technology and hurting the resource. The correlation is, our attitudes, right? I mean, you look at what people did with the North American bison populations, where there was memoirs where bison herds went from one horizon to the other, in places like Bismarck and Dickinson and Sydney, Montana, and you think about how many millions of animals there must have been in North America at the time. And people were able to wipe them out with open sights. They had a rifle that had a range of 400, 500 yards, but there was no optics, there was no rangefinder, there was no nothing, right? And so it's just lack of common sense and greed is what destroys stuff, right? And so I think that's what we got to get back. We're in a minnow on a perch slough, and enough people take enough.
Oh, absolutely.
Basic stuff, and so the technology is just for our enjoyment and fun, and what we do with it is what matters.
Absolutely. So great info, Jason. Appreciate your time. And what can we expect from you in the next few months here? What are some of your trips?
There's lots of fishing. I'm going to be like an opportunist. I mean, I'm going to try to get out to the Yellowstone River in eastern Montana here coming up, just because I haven't spent a lot of time. I used to fish over towards the confluence in the pump house when I was younger, but looking forward to spending some time out there. I'm going to be down at Francis Case here this upcoming week. Actually, that'll be some SCHEELS training, but I'm going to do as much fishing as I can. And then eastern South Dakota, Devil's Lake, northern Minnesota. I'm going to be hitting it pretty hard here now. So.
All right.
Awesome. Fishing, so little time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we won't keep you any longer. You can get back in the boat. So appreciate the time. Appreciate the knowledge. Thanks for everything, Jason.
You bet. Thank you.
That'll do.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate the time, Jason.
You bet. We'll be in touch.
Yep. Bye now.
Bye.